Hi everyone, and welcome to the final session of the first ever Virtually conference. A massive thanks to everyone that has tuned in from all over the world, our presenters and Jane at One-to-One Captions for providing our live captions. We will have all the talks from the last 3 days online and available a bit later today, and we'll be emailing you all links to watch those back. Our next virtual event is from Joel, who presented with Simon in the last session with his webinar, The Commercial Impact of Accessibility, and that's on the 8th of June at 2 p.m. Also, I'm really excited to launch Collaborate Virtual next week. This is the virtual iteration of our long-running Bristol conference, Collaborate, which focuses on collaboration and design. This will be a week-long free virtual event taking place from the 12th to 16th of July. So do keep an eye on our social channels for when tickets are online, and please do join us for that. I'm going to let Simon introduce our final session of the conference, which is a discussion on the future of accessibility. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. As always, please do join in the discussion with the chat and make sure the settings are switched to panelists and attendees so everyone can see your messages. And do let us know if there are any issues with the stream. Also, please submit your questions for the panel using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window, and Simon will pose these to the panel at the end. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Simon to introduce the session.
Thanks, Henry. Hi, everyone. So welcome to the future of our accessibility discussion today. So this is the kind of final session, as Henry said, and we've had fantastic talks across the last 3 days that have really been exploring the kind of importance and value of thinking from an accessibility perspective and how we can actually design inclusive systems, technology, society, and what kind of benefits that will bring. I'm joined today by 3 people that are going to introduce themselves in a mo, but you know, we've got experts from a design perspective with us, from an AI perspective, from a blockchain perspective, from a VR perspective as well. So I think that these are really kind of key, because these are some of the sort of emerging technologies that we're kind of seeing that are coming through, and the need to ensure that we can design with these, you know, with these technologies is accessibly is really, really, really important. This is not going to be a technical accessibility conversation. You know, this is going to be more about how do we think about designing an inclusive world? What are the things that we need to do? Okay, so just to kind of frame it in that way. And with no further ado, I'm going to now kind of switch over to our kind of 3 panelists. And I would like, Pete, you to kind of introduce yourself, please, sir.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me, Simon. My name is Pete Trainor. I'm the CEO of Vala Health. We're a telemedicine platform. I took over about 18 months ago. Most people, though, know me as the designer guy. And I've had a long background now in AI data, interoperable data, and designing with those materials, which has been really, really fascinating. And we've been trying to bring some of that into the healthcare space. So I'm going to save some of my thoughts for the panel, but I've got lots to say on this one.
Thanks, Pete. And Laura, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hi Simon, hi guys, pleasure to be here. My name's Laura Sheerman. I'm education and research lead for a startup ed tech company in Scotland called The Learning Loop, so shout out to them. My particular interest is in looking at bringing education and VR together and look at that integration. And I've got a long background in lecturing education, and I'm also a doctoral student looking at this issue at University of West of England. So looking forward to getting involved in some discussion. Great,
thanks, Laura. And finally, but by no means last, Georgia.
Thank you. Real pleasure to be here. I'm Georgia Rakusen. I'm a lead user researcher, currently freelance. I work in the blockchain space. I work for a range of clients ranging from scaled technology businesses to startups, all sometimes very early stage. And I've been a cryptocurrency user myself for a very long time now. And I've spent a lot of that time advocating for the voice of the user and all users to product teams and CEOs. I'm also interestingly working on a central bank digital currency research initiative to explore the possible use cases and benefits and risks of a central bank bringing out its own digital currency.
Great. No, I'm really, really, really excited and honored to have you three talented people here today. So, right, let's get down to business. So my first question that I kind of want to put to you, and I'd like Pete to kind of start with this one. So how are innovations within your respective fields improving the lives of others? And those that may traditionally have experienced, barriers to using technology?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a big question to kick off on. I think what's really interesting, so I'm going to answer that in two parts. My industry and then how we've had to address things as Vala. I think what's been deeply fascinating over the last 18 months, without dwelling on all of the things that have been going on in the world, is actually a lot of healthcare services have had to be radically simplified for all audiences, and access to healthcare. Technology has played a major part in that. So we've seen like a rapid innovation cycle over the last kind of 18 months or so, like massively trying to simplify things. And when I think about accessibility, I do think a lot about simplification and just simplifying things right down to the lowest brilliant common denominators. So actually, one of the things that we've had to do over the last 18 months or so, the last couple of years especially, but radically expedite in the last 18 months or so, is make sure that not just people who have the impairments that accessibility is traditionally kind of labeled against, but my parents who are in their late 70s that can't get down to the healthcare practices that they traditionally go to have had to start using technology. They're not technically savvy people, so we've had to simplify things for them. We've seen a huge a kind of a big push over the last 18 months or so to try and get barriers to adoption of technology being ripped down, and that's where kind of AI and data and voice and video, text to speech, and various technologies have really kind of come into their own. So it's been a phenomenally busy 18 months or so in the kind of accessibility of healthcare services. Tech has been the linchpin, the major piece at play in all of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, that's really interesting in itself. The idea of simplification as a means to actually design something that's more inclusive. I mean, I think that there is a really great insight, and I really like the way that you kind of framed it as not just, say, traditional accessibility challenges, but everyone needs health and everyone needs to be supported in this way. So I think the fact that you're thinking it like that is great. Superb answer. How would you kind of address that then, Georgia? How do you think about your technologies and what the kind of what the barriers are and how we can address them?
Well, building off what Pete said, about simplicity, and what you said as well about, everyone has health and needs access to health services. Everybody, whether you like it or not, needs and has to have access to financial services too, to some degree, apart from those who decide to remove themselves from those systems. So blockchain and Web3 technologies have the potential to really revolutionize and democratize to some degree access for people who traditionally are underserved by traditional finance. The people with the least money pay the most fees in banking. That's the way it works, and it's a real problem for lots of individuals. But so the potential for blockchain and crypto is there. Where it's at right now is very inaccessible. I challenge really anybody here to go and try for the first time some of the Web3 products that are out there. They're difficult for anybody to use, let alone people with specific accessibility needs right now. And that's, the technological barrier to getting use of these services has actually increased with Web3 right now. To be fair, it's in this experimental stage. I think some of the things that are that could happen, especially around things like a digital currency issued by a bank, let's say, it's difficult to work out, why is this better than me having a credit card, going to my local bank, or using PayPal or anything like that? But if you think about the groups of people who maybe live paycheck to paycheck, and in particular economies as well, if transactions are not immediate, you might have all your outgoings on the same day as your payday, but the money doesn't come in until the following Monday. So you've got this gap, you go into your overdraft, you lose money, or you may have to take things like payday loans. So something like a digital currency could actually allow you to be paid even daily by your employer, so that by the end of the month you've received your full month's amount, but you're not waiting till the end of that, with no additional costs to make that work. There are loads of risks in implementing something like this, and that's what user research is about, trying to make sure that we don't make mistakes in the technical development of this. And I should add that it is by default assumed that if you're going to use blockchain or Web3 technologies, you're going to be using technology. And that means automatically excluding people who cannot, who will not, who are afraid or don't have the education enabled to do it. I'm hoping that we'll bridge that gap.
I mean, I think that's, yeah, I mean, it's a very honest and detailed answer, because I think this idea that you mentioned around democratization is pretty critical, because if we're truly going to see the adoption of these technologies at scale and representing inclusion for everyone, then that democratization is pretty key to that, right? And I kind of it kind of made me think about Web 1.3 and some of the new tech that's there, is that these things tend to have sort of an adoption life cycle, don't they, as well, where you get the early adopters, and it could be that there's something there to unpack in terms of how, and I'm kind of thinking aloud here as a design type person, that how do we address that? Because people aren't going to stop making technology. There's going to be Web 4.0, et cetera, et cetera. So the goal is, how do we design it, or how can we start to get people thinking so that this idea of democratization happens? But yeah, really, really, really great points, and actually kind of just underlined by your honesty, which is refreshing.
I'm a crypto user, but I'm also a crypto skeptic. It's got to be useful, and the main use cases are yet to be discovered.
Yeah, and that's a powerful way to say it. So Laura, what's your perspective in terms of, say, new technologies and potential barriers, and what we kind of need to do to sort of make it inclusive?
Yeah, sure. So I think to make technology inclusive, and I speak from this from a sort of virtual reality perspective, is that I reflect back on the previous points made around it being equitable technology. So when you think of VR, you've got the automatic assumption is that you're going to need a high-end headset, it's going to cost the earth, a super fast broadband connection to actually run it, when actually we're able to reap the rewards of extended reality. So that means that we can lower the bar for accessibility in terms of getting access to, for example, 360 virtual reality. So a lot of my work at the moment that we're bringing in 360 virtual reality into social care, which is by nature an area that is not well served, it's not well funded. So we can get that stridence made into these kind of sectors, because you just need a smartphone. You just need a Google Cardboard headset, not talking hundreds of pounds. We're offering something that's equitable and scalable. But I would really add to that you can't do this in silo. So you've got technology companies that have got all this great tech on offer. They're looking at the recent developments from HTC, from Vive, for facial trackers. You can develop for that, but you actually need to co-produce and co-create content with your audience that it's for. So you need to ensure that you support them along that journey to get that kind of production and that kind of co-production at scale. Because otherwise what you end up doing is producing something that no one can really kind of tap into, and it's kind of almost redundant. I had some interesting discussions recently with Dr. Gary Berner at Nottingham University, who developed Notopia on the Mozilla platform. So Mozilla is a readily available social platform, and what he's done, he's developed a learning environment to run his master's module, and it was a huge success. You know, the students loved it, great raving reviews. They just came back in outside of classroom times to just go and spend time and chill and show their kind of friends around this environment. So we spent some time talking about, well, how can you scale this? What's the next steps for it? Actually, you need to look at the institution on a wider scale and make the case that this is something that is beneficial, but also to ensure that educators are supported to understand it. So he was telling me the story that he'd gone out to educators, colleagues, explained what happened, explained the success of it, but there wasn't really any kind of understanding of how it could be applied, or educators didn't have the confidence to take that forward. So I think he ended up securing a very small number of headsets to take this project forward. So there's got to be looking at the both ends of, yes, okay, high end, but also looking at more equitable VR that, you know, those that may suffer digital exclusion can access. Because at the end of the day, the education platform is a way that we can support equity and equality. So there's ethical principles underpinning VR. It's not just about flashy technology and bells and whistles. There's some sentiment there around ethics and ensure that's equitable for every student that we are working with within the classroom. And certainly that has to be sustainable for the institutions in which it evolves in. And we need to get the evidence base for that technology, which at the moment is quite small, and it's an evolving and emerging picture. So if you take, for example, body swaps, we've got kind of small pilots popping up. The work that we're doing, it's piloting to grow that evidence base. And the more that we evolve with that, and the more that we work with educators in the sector, the more likely we are to achieve the correct fit for that to go forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you know, there's a few ideas there that I thought kind of resonated quite deeply. I mean, you know, one of the things that I kind of just jotted down is this social aspect. So, and often that's something that is implied, but actually the kind of benefit of it is real. It's really real. And you know, the way that you spoke about the kind of students that were sort of going in not just to do, say, the kind of master's modules and content, but you know, they're kind of going to be there to be together. I mean, you know, this is the kind of concept, right? And I think that, yeah, you're absolutely right. If we're going to democratize, to, you know, to kind of Georgia's point, technology, so there is mass adoption, you know, we need to make sure that it's open. You know, we can't, you know, you can't have it's strange, and you can't have one organization that makes a completely accessible technology, but it comes at a high cost, because that in itself basically presents some form of exclusion, right?
Right, and one of the conversations that we've had with developing a platform is that there's a, you know, the Vader, for example, brought out an XR cloud-based platform to develop on. Now, the issue with that, it needs a super fast broadband connection. So if you're going to build a platform or take that to an education sector, you're going to alienate, you know, most of that student population that can't afford it. So one way to overcome it, the solution that we're working on is this 360 VR. We're building kind of branch narratives that are accessible on a smartphone with a Google Cardboard, which is, generally speaking, students do have access to that technology, if nothing else, that doesn't require that bandwidth to run.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I kind of want to, I'm going to focus in on that point. So, you know, let's think about, you know, we've got two really important aspects. You know, we've got health and financial services. I mean, most people in society, and when I mean most, we're pretty much talking about everyone. Every adult will you know, have to kind of come into contact with those types of services. And just picking on that point that you kind of made about 360, well, I mean, what Georgia, I mean, what do you think about that kind of 360 ideal from a virtual perspective? You know, when you think about financial services.
Interesting. There is a subset of people building on blockchain, doing stuff with VR, currently experimenting there. But I think what they're creating is playgrounds for the rich. and nothing of particular use, you could say, or utility for the general people. I love what Laura was saying, and I think, you know, you've got to bring in people. You're going to build a product. You can't be, if you build an accessible product, you can't then price people out of it. And we have a problem in blockchain, which is that currently, if you want to do anything on, say, the Ethereum network, you have to pay to play. There is no try before you buy. So what does that mean for accessibility? So you have to know what you're doing, be willing to potentially lose some money in order to experiment and learn. And that's, to me, is unacceptable. I'm trying to champion some quite good simulators at the minute, kind of on the VR line, to help people educate, be able to play around, to experience what decentralized money is like before they then take the leap. And I think that would be invaluable if we could get more products and teams to do it. Unfortunately, the incentives are misaligned. So there is so much money in crypto right now that it pays currently to make something that is currently exists well, and put a slightly better interest rate on it, and then everyone moves to it. Honestly, it's quite remarkable. The difference between, say, what we in Web3 call Web 2, the Web 2 revenue model. You know, if you're going to come up with a product idea, you come up with the idea, you have to test it in the market. It gets holes poked in it, you get customer feedback, and then someone gives you millions of pounds. It's totally the opposite way in Web3. You write a white paper, you can raise $250 million. That's not an exaggeration. One product has done this. And then how much runway have you got to build what? For who? You know, and these aren't people necessarily who care about things like accessibility. That's the hardest problem to work on. So why don't we just work on this easier problem here, which is making rich people richer? And I think the problem is that the industry is in a place of immaturity, and we'll get there, but it can be frustrating.
No, they're great. I really like what you said about simulators there. And I think, you know, going back to your point about democratization, I think being able to show people how they can participate in, say, you know, decentralized a decentralized environment is absolutely critical. You know, we have to show them what it's like, so they know, you know, so it would become something that can be mass adopted. So yeah, I mean, that sounds like a perfect opportunity or kind of marriage, but you know, between VR and sort of decentralized sort of finance, and how simulators could be used. Pete, so I'm thinking about kind of health, which is, you know, no understatement here, probably the biggest thing on everyone's agenda in probably the history of the 21st century. If you're not thinking about health, it's like, what island are you on? Because everybody wants to be there. Because I think you couldn't be anywhere and not be thinking about health. But what's your view based on, you know, some of the things that you've just heard?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've all got it, haven't we? So it's the one thing that I think unifies everybody at the moment. And actually has been astonishingly humbling over the last kind of couple of years working in healthcare is that because it is the single unifier, it doesn't matter if you're somebody that's suffering from Parkinson's, old age, you have a neurodiversity, a neurodiverse condition, you know, you're blind, you're hard of hearing, like you're able-bodied, thankfully, but you have dyslexia. Like, there's a multitude of things that bind us all together. And I think what we've started to see over the last couple of months, the last 18 months at least, is that everybody's realized that we're all at a slight disadvantage in some way. And our health conditions are the thing that bind us all together. And then somehow that kind of levels technology as a playing field a little bit. So the healthcare industry has been astonishing in the last 18 months. We've really kind of come around as a group of businesses all over the world, and with our national health services and our private healthcare services, and tried to work out how we can make everything as accessible as possible. We're less concerned in the healthcare industry with, you know, whatever number the web is. and more just how the heck can we make sure that everybody gets access to it, regardless of their ability or inclusivity or exclusivity. So it's a leveler, I think, is the best way of putting it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in your work for Vala, you've been at the the kind of mountain's edge for basically, probably since you joined, right? So you've got, you've had a real awakening in terms of what access to health means to people in real terms.
Yeah, I mean, it's life and death. And that's no exaggeration to some people. Actually, to some people it is, I'm really worried about something, and you've got kind of various forms of mental health down at one end, fear, anxiety, worry, just getting answers. And then at the other end, you've got people that need to access life-saving care and attention as quickly as possible. I think one of the things that I've been massively annoyed about over the years is it's easier to get a taxi delivered in one click to your door than it is to get, a medication that some people rely on every single day in order to be able to function properly delivered. And so, those kind of things are now starting to kind of come into some stark focus and start to be solved a little bit. There's been a huge amount of inequality in the way that, to George's point, actually, about how money's been spent in technology over the last 2 or 3 decades. I've got some fairly strong opinions on inclusive design and how that should have gone. I might save that for another question, but I think certainly there's the vision of the industry has been thrust upon everybody. So it's going to be really exciting in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I think that point that you made about it's easier to get a taxi with a click over something, that could literally, as you say, be life and death, is, going to be a big commercial opportunity and potentially, a great form of needed disruption, right? I mean, that would be a great service to actually have, and it's probably, given the kind of post-COVID world that we're living in, is going to be, I'd like to think that there's a bunch of people out there that are thinking about that, and that would be something that is pretty important. So
let me give you a very, very quick example. I'm sorry to jump in, but I want to bring this to life a little bit, and it's going to be really quick. So last year we had a patient on our platform who had Parkinson's. She was not able to get to her doctor because of the lockdowns and they were shut, to get medication that she relied on in order to be able to function correctly. We were able to do that for her. That was great. We then partnered with a pharmacy called Signature Pharmacy, incredible company, who within 3 or 4 weeks had created a seamless end-to-end encrypted, blockchain encrypted prescription service, and worked out via couriers how to get that kind of medication delivered to her door. So, they did it for her, but then they were able to scale that up to every single person that needs to get their hand on a regulated prescribed drug, like very, very quickly. 3 weeks of innovation and that was done. My question was, like, why hadn't that been done 10 years ago? One, but thank goodness it was done really, really quickly. And also, brilliant that those people now don't have to go outside. If they don't want to go and get their prescriptions from a pharmacy, they can just kind of order it like an Uber. But it took a lockdown in order for that kind of accessible service to start to exist. Yeah,
it's a shame sometimes that these sort of positive outcomes are driven by something which has, quite sad undercurrent. And that's a massive oversimplification there, because obviously you just don't want to get drawn into that conversation, because it's there, isn't it, in everything that we do at the moment. So that just kind of coming on to my next question here. So if I asked you to think about one thing that you could recommend to kind of ensure that we were designing and developing technology from a kind of accessible perspective, thinking about inclusivity, what would it be? And that goes to Laura first, please.
Yeah, sure. So I think the key thing is to work with the stakeholders with who we are actually designing products for, to better understand what are the barriers and challenges that particularly older people, for example, face in accessing some of these technologies, to understand it from their perspective and co-design solutions rather than kind of running off and think we've got the idea and all the knowledge, when actually we're designing something that doesn't fit. It's not the person environment fit, we think it does the job, but does it from the user perspective? So I think there has to be a lot of co-collaboration and talks, doing research, sharing the research and findings, and having more of an open discussion about what is working, not being frightened to bring in those groups which may have challenges around accessing some of this technology, rather than just developing for the core. You know, we're not going to be able to scale technology if we don't think about these people that may experience accessibility issues, and we don't bring them into the discussion. If we leave them outside of the time, that's not going to work for future developments.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, you know, you've just basically put a strong business case there for user research in just suggesting co-collaboration. I wholeheartedly, unequivocally agree with you. It's a really great point. So, Georgia, what kind of one thing would you be thinking of? We want to kind of make designers and developers really think about inclusive technology.
What Laura said. No, I agree wholeheartedly with Laura, because I'm a user researcher, so I absolutely, bring voices inside, talk to those people. But it's sort of building on that. It's about organizational culture. Culture can be a bit of a dirty word as well, because what does an internal culture mean at a company, but certainly you need diverse voices within the company. They'll be the first people to say, I can't use that, and to open your eyes to their needs. Humans get the message when they interact with other humans and see it, at the coalface, as it were. Now you can do that much quicker if you have those people in your company than maybe building a company and then, building a product and then testing it with audiences to find out that actually it's not suitable for everybody. You're going to have a more inclusive design culture, more accessibility minded culture if you have a variety, varied people with different capabilities and needs that help you as builders, designers and developers empathize with this sometimes kind of hypothetical user. We end up with personas. Rarely is that one persona for a company, a person with accessibility needs, so building out a company that represents a wider populace is a great tip for that.
Yeah, I really like that idea around culture. I completely agree with that. I mean, when you think about it from a cultural perspective, you're taking a holistic perspective, right? You're thinking much more broadly, and it means and that you're open to discovery and to learning and to trying to be less assumptive.
You as an employer, you have a legal requirement to the people in your company and to cater for their different needs. So what better way to open your eyes to the different audiences out there than have to serve the people right next to you first?
Yeah, it's a great point, a really great point. So, Pete, and to you, sir.
You're on mute, Pete.
Sorry,
hey.
I'm on mute. How long have we been doing this now? We've been doing this for a year and I'm still on mute. Look, I can only agree with the points from Laura and Georgia. I think the biggest problem over the last 30 plus years is that a lot of the technology that we consume every day has been created, invented and spewed into the world by people that look like me. The white privileged man in various shiny towers around the world, and that's a massive issue, and it's still a massive issue now. And this is a conversation about accessibility, but I think inclusivity is a massive problem when most of the technology that we're molding into solutions has been built by people that aren't victims of discrimination and exclusion, like full stop. So like we have to include, not just for ticking boxes, the different voices into the design process, but actually because the people that who end up consuming what we're building, are often the best people to design it in the first place. And so I think the quicker we get that into our heads as organizations and businesses, the better. I think the other thing just to note is that what we've seen over the last kind of 10 years as a trend is this kind of concept of cobbling SaaS products together in different industries to kind of solve problems. So black box AI, big data sets that we get off the shelf, blah, 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 blah. Like, how much of that has been designed by people with an accessibility issue, and how much of that data that we're using to train systems has come from audiences that suffer from all of the things that we have very little comprehension about because we're not victims of those issues. So we have got an incredibly long way to go before we solve this problem. I will tell you that now, because we're sitting on 30, 40 years of historical gunk that we need to get over.
Yeah, I mean, it's a brilliant point. I mean, all 3 points are really fantastic. And I think diversity, you're right. It's not until we allow equal participation, we're not really going to kind of design equality, are we? I mean, it's just, yeah, and it's not down to us to kind of say how it should be for everyone else. I mean, it's a very hard thing to get over from a design perspective. It's, and something that I've been saying for years is, we're not, you're not designing for yourself. That's the problem. You need to be thinking about how can you involve all those voices that actually could really contribute and probably make a difference in a more accelerated way than what has happened over, say, the last 30 or 40 years. And I think, and I hope that kind of part of what we've gone through in the last sort of, 18 months and will be ongoing for a while is kind of will help to accelerate that need for care and deep consideration of people. So, so the idea of, diversity is more embraced, that this idea of culture is better understood. And, we know, going back to kind of what Laura said, this idea of co-collaboration, essentially, user research, really trying to apply that. I mean, these are just, they're kind of box standards from our perspective. And often I kind of feel that privilege myself, working in an industry that I know embraces that. But, it's not about patting yourself on the back because you work in an industry that embraces that. It's about actually thinking, how can we get that message so the diversity aspect is bigger, so the cultural aspect is bigger, so the idea of co-collaboration is bigger. So yeah, I mean, they're really great points that you've made. I've kind of noted them all down and I've gone, yeah, that's a great point, that's a great point, that's a great point. So I'm going to come on to my final question now. Okay, so if you could name one example that you think is really good, or at least beginning to show that there's an opportunity to be inclusive, what comes to mind? And I want that to go to sort of Georgia first.
Yeah, sure. So a best practice, an example of best in class in my industry, I'm going to talk to specifically. The things that come to mind, the three cornerstones it's got to cover: education, trust. So you have to be able to explain why someone should trust you in the first place, your product, and simulation. So that's try before you buy. And the best example that I've seen, and people who are in blockchain will hate me for saying this, is Coinbase. It is one of the biggest and most popular commercial centralized organizations. It is not a blockchain company, it's just sells cryptocurrency, but they have a whole section on there called Coinbase Earn, and you can just try things out and earn free cryptocurrency without it costing you anything, right? So you have the onboarding already, they solve that problem, and the education element as well, which I think is really valuable. I personally have run accessibility audits on several decentralized finance projects. None of them scored well at all. I think, but I know that there are people building best practice and design guidelines now for these audiences, like going, well, okay, we have this group of people now who are already onboarded. How do we get to the next million or the next billion? We're going to have really good design guidelines to help these product teams who don't really know how best to attack this. They need help and support. So I'm excited to see some of these coming on board now. If you Google like Web3 design guidelines, there's quite a few coming out now. So which includes accessibility as it should for any good product designer. So I'm pleased to see that.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Laura, one innovation or best practice that you think kind of stands out? I know you mentioned kind of Nottingham University, but I'm kind of hopeful that you have another as well.
Yeah, I'd like to point to Oculus. They've actually, in October, the end of last year, they developed a set of accessibility standards directly for developers, taking into account wider populations of different needs and disabilities. So things about thinking how you integrate voice recognition, audio cues, captioning into virtual reality. And a good example of that is something like Outspace VR, where they are starting to build these into their designs and social platforms. I think there's some way to go for widespread adoption and design, but the fact that we've actually now got some sort of guideline and standards which are emerging is really encouraging. And I think it sets a good pathway for that work to continue in the future. And sector specific for me, in education, the Association for Learning and Technology have just put out a sort of an ethical guideline for consultation to say, well, we're bringing in EdTech like virtual reality. What is it that we want to put in there to make sure that it's equitable and accessible? Accessibility is strongly featured in there, as well as kind of taking into consideration digital poverty. So it is these frameworks which are gradually coming out the woodwork, which we are slowly starting to see them being applied and gradually built into VR applications, which are being deployed now and sort of in the future. So hopefully that work will continue to roll.
Oh, great. And Mr. Trainor?
For me, it's a theme that I want to see continuing. I am completely in awe and love with anything that kind of passively data collects. So ethically, wearables, we've been talking about it for a decade plus, but it's incredible in the healthcare space, this idea that, we can put a wearable device on anybody, regardless of their ability, and collect information about them without them having to go and like bang it in or key it in themselves or do anything. Voice, again, it's been around for a while. We're seeing it really come into its own at the moment because it suddenly breaks down the barriers of all sorts of accessibility issues. Face as well. So, and if I start to think about sort of devices that are encompassing of all of these things, then we start to see a future that's actually way more accessible and way more fun for a lot of people. So, the idea of these kind of things that are 40, 50 quid now, that you can buy from that giant e-commerce website or your next best example, but they're brilliant. They've got a camera, they look at your face, you can use your voice to book an appointment or order something. They're collecting data, they're doing voice into text, they're doing facial recognition. Like there's a ton of stuff that these things can do, and that passive data collecting just instantly makes many industries more accessible for people who ordinarily are just scared of technology, as well as having problems accessing it.
That's great. And I think design guidelines show great hope, because obviously they set a foundation, don't they, in terms of what we can do, but also as well what we can improve. That's kind of one of the things that often gets forgotten about, designing technology. I like the phrase Maya, most advanced yet accessible, but I'm going to kind of caveat that point by saying what's Maya today might not necessarily be Maya in 1 year, right? So, within that idea of like frameworks and actual standards is this opportunity to constantly think about how we can increase the sort of circle of inclusion. Yeah, that's the concept here, and I'd like to think by increasing that we can increase the circle of diversity. I mean, yeah, I kind of told a story earlier about the fact that by 2050 that we've done this, and it is my hope and my desire that truly will happen. Otherwise, I might feel that my great effort working in this industry for almost 30 years is basically going to go without reward, because that's what I would truly like to be able to kind of see happen, this idea of humanization at scale. So yeah, we kind of, I've been looking across the kind of chat, and I've kind of sort of adapted questions and stuff as we've kind of gone. But I'd like to kind of just, finish with, I'd like to kind of just like a sort of a closing statement from all kind of three of you about if you had a magic wand and you could do one thing, what would it be? And that goes to you, Mr. Pete, first, please, sir.
If I had a magic wand, I wish we didn't talk about accessibility, because it just is. And it wasn't a department or a person's job or, a topic that we needed a conference about, because it's just, radical simplification of all technology so that everybody has access, is my hope.
Beautiful. Georgia?
One thing I wish that would happen is greater education in my industry amongst the product teams about different audience types, and get them thinking about that. It's early days still in blockchain development. Some people have only just started thinking about users, let alone distinct user needs. So I would love for some really attention-grabbing educational thing to come along and just give them that light bulb moment to realize that they need to be doing this stuff.
Oh, great. That's a really great point. Agreed. I'm taking that advice myself right now. And Laura?
Yeah, I think if I had a magic wand, I like to bring in those users that do experience those challenges and barriers to technology use, and see them directly inputted into the design process and being part of that, and building on sort of Georgia's research, bring them in closer and have more consultations, and perhaps bring them out on platforms like this to give the user voice out there, and get larger tech companies to perhaps think a bit more dynamically, a bit more inclusively about the impact of the technology that they are actually building and creating, and who their audiences are, to build those creative narratives and inclusive narratives that we're looking for in tech.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And Pete, I'm just going to kind of sort of close it out and kind of finish here. And you guys have been fantastic. This is definitely going to be a presentation that I'm going to go and listen to again. And as Henry said, it's going to be online so everyone can listen to it, which is great. But yeah, we have got to transcend this idea of talking about users. We have to realize that the game is people, and it's about participation. And it's something that Pete just said there. And he's been a long time advocate of not using language that inadvertently and secretly, unbeknown to us, dehumanizes us. So I think that's a really good point that's made. And Pete has written a great book about this as well, called that has this kind of model called Hippo, the sort of human focused digital book. So for anyone that basically wants to sort of do a little bit of a deeper dive into that, and have a little bit of an exploration through the mind of Trainor, I would really urge you to go and kind of have that book.
It's a very old book now. I wouldn't go digging around in my mind if I was
you're being too humble, as always. It's still a great book. I think I read it twice, so it's got to be a great book. So there aren't many books that I've read twice. Okay, I've never read Ulysses twice.
Never read Ulysses once.
I don't think many people can read Ulysses. I don't even think it's one of those works of wonder. I think it's written to be inaccessible because it is truly brilliant. But yeah, your book, I think, has incredible value because, again, the advocacy around people, the advocacy around human, something that's close to my heart again. And it's nice to see you kind of raise that flag. You know, that's one of the things that I find most endearing about you, sir. So, you know, guys, today I've got to say that it's been fantastic. You know, the things that we've touched upon, you know, starting out with the whole idea of simplification. I mean, yeah, I mean, there's a number one design insight that everyone should be using, you know, thinking about collaboration, design standards, thinking about user research. I mean, Laura, you're a great advocate for a user researcher. I mean, you know, you sound like a user researcher. I have a good idea of what user researchers sound like, and they sound like you and Georgia. You sound just like a user researcher. And I have to be careful because I could talk to user researchers all day if I was basically given the time. But unfortunately, like most other people, I have a job as well. So I'd like to say, Georgia, Pete, Laura, thank you so much for being part of this session. You were, as expected, above and beyond Uber.
Thank you. Been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Fantastic experience. Thanks very much.
Awesome. What a great way to round off the conference too. And yeah, again, a huge thanks to everyone that has presented, watched, and joined us over the last 3 days. And also a big shout out to the marketing team here at Nomensa for making all of this happen behind the scenes. If you have any questions on accessibility, if you're interested in joining the team here at Nomensa, or you just want a general chat about design, please get in touch with us at hello@nomensa.com. I'm sure if anyone has any questions for the panelists, they can get in touch with you on Twitter and continue the discussion there. We're going to be sending out links to all the talk recordings shortly, and we'd love to hear your feedback on the conference. I did mention earlier we're launching Collaborate Virtual next week, which is the virtual iteration of our long-running Bristol conference Collaborate, which focuses on collaboration and design. That is taking place on the 12th to the 16th of July. So yeah, keep an eye on our social channels for when tickets are online, and please do join us then. So yeah, that's it for the first ever virtually conference. And yeah, we hope to see you next year. Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.